Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, traditionalists and Tumblr users, welcome to Clarifying Catholicism. You're watching part 1 of my series, Vatican II's Theology of Other Religions, Discontinuity or Reform. Most of this information is drawn from my master's thesis, which you can find in the description. To see the rest of the show, check the playlist in the description. Without further ado, on to the show. Wake up, O man! For your sake, God became man. On December 22, 2005, Pope Benedict XVI quoted St. Augustine to begin his first Christmas address to the Roman Curia. He'd just become Pope fairly recently. After honoring the recently deceased Pope John Paul II, the Holy Father turned his attention to a subject of great importance to him and his predecessor, the Second Vatican Council's legacy. Benedict, as the former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, quite the title, oversaw much of the Council's implementation since 1981. 24 years later, he recognized that the Council's realization still faced major stumbling blocks. In his speech, Benedict portrayed the Council's legacy as embattled, stating, "On the one hand, there is an interpretation that I would call a hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture." This response to the Council, according to the Holy Father, was spearheaded by theologians who characterized the Council's theology as discontinuous with that of its predecessors, for the sake of promoting progressive doctrinal innovations. On the other hand, Benedict praised the hermeneutic of reform, which he described as renewal in the continuity of the one subject church, which the Lord has given to us. Benedict's choice to make this battle over the Council's legacy the subject of his first Christmas address to the Curia demonstrates how the Council's interpretation and implementation, even 40 years after its closure, was still quite relevant. Almost a decade after Benedict's address, the historian and theologian Gavin da Costa categorized the progressive hermeneutic of discontinuity as one of 4 responses to Vatican II. Type 1 theologians believe that the spirit of the Council, or the true intentions of progressive Council fathers, would gradually be realized in the following decades. In his address, Benedict summarized this group's position. In a word, it would be necessary not to follow the texts of the Council, but its spirit. It claims that the texts of the Council are the result of compromises in which, to reach unanimity, it was found necessary to keep and confirm many old things that are now pointless. Given how many of these theologians considered Vatican II as a definitive break from other councils in a very positive light, I'll refer to them as being in the pro-discontinuity camp. Da Costa accuses these theologians of favoring historical context over the content of their approved texts themselves, thereby replacing bishops with historians as magisterial authorities. And now we'll turn our attention to one example of a theologian who many categorize has embraced this pro-discontinuity approach. On July 26, 1986, many years before becoming Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger sent a letter to Father Charles Curran, a professor of moral theology at the Catholic University of America, informing him that he could no longer teach because of his public dissent against the sexual ethics taught in Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae. Curran believed that the post-conciliar church needed to move away from its rigid sexual doctrines. He professed that the church's doctrine could and should change, noting, "All, however, must recognize that Catholic social teaching changed quite a bit over the course of the 20th century, whereas there has been little to no change in official Catholic sexual teaching." Criticizing Benedict's general overemphasis on doctrinal continuity, Curran noted slavery, usury, the purpose of marriage, religious freedom, and the role of women in society as examples in which church teaching fundamentally changed. Curran's focus on discontinuity in church teaching demonstrates how many theologians were eager to embrace the hermeneutic of discontinuity for the sake of progress. For pro-discontinuity theologians like Curran, the Second Vatican Council was just the beginning of a larger process of discontinuity. Now, while the progressive responses to Vatican II were the primary target of Pope Benedict's criticisms, Such positions were hardly the only ones that dispute the Council's continuity. DaCosta calls the second category of response to the Council Type 2. It includes traditionalists who rightfully insisted that continuity is vital for the Church, but they claim that the Council's documents violate such continuity. This group, which will be referred to as anti-discontinuity, is divided into two subcategories. First, there are those who reduce the Council's documents to mere pastoral suggestions that hold little weight and thus can be ignored. Basically, Vatican II's documents were so theologically weak that we don't really need to worry about them anyways. These theologians will be referred to as the inconsequentialists. They cite Pope John XXIII's words at the Council's convocation as evidence that conciliar teachings are merely strategies that hold little doctrinal value. Pope John XXIII, of course, famously said, "The salient point of this council is not, therefore, a discussion of one article or another of the fundamental doctrine of the Church, which has been repeatedly taught by the Fathers and by ancient and modern theologians, and which is presumed to be well known and familiar to all. For this, a council was not necessary." Inconsequentialists claim that this means the council did not authoritatively comment on any doctrines, even though John more likely meant that the council would not confine itself to one particular doctrine, as had been done in the past, like how Chalcedon specifically focused on Christ's natures. On the other hand, some theologians, which we call consequentialists, believe that certain doctrines indeed changed and therefore must be reversed. Many of these theologians believe that because the Second Vatican Council erred, the papacy and the College of Bishops forfeited their authority, which can only be restored by a rejection of the Council's false doctrines. In summary, anti-discontinuity theologians hold that either the Council never intended on defining new doctrines, so its teachings can be ignored, or it did define new doctrines and they must be reversed as soon as possible. DaCosta uses Bishop Marcel Lefebvre as an example of someone who not only embraced an anti-discontinuity response to the Council, but fluctuated between consequentialism and inconsequentialism throughout his career. Lefebvre initially adopted an inconsequentialist position, that the Council's teachings were merely pastoral and thus not doctrinally binding or all that important. Teachings on ecumenism and interreligious dialogue, for example, were inconsequential precisely because they were not infallibly defined. Once it became clear, though, that the Church had no intention of abandoning its positions on those issues, Lefebvre changed his approach. He denied the validity of the Council altogether, embracing a consequentialist mentality. In his Profession of Faith, Lefebvre writes, "We refuse and have always refused to follow the Rome of neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies, which clearly manifested themselves in the Second Vatican Council and after the Council in all the reforms which issued from it." Lefebvre, like Curran, also faced consequences for embracing the hermeneutic of discontinuity when he was excommunicated for invalidly ordaining bishops. It is worth noting the final two types of response to Vatican II identified by DaCosta. Type 3 theologians accept the Council as continuous. This thesis will refer to Type 3 as pro-continuity. Other theologians, Type 4, claim that the Council was a bit too late in addressing a world that had shifted from modernism to postmodernism. Because of its lateness, the Council was altogether irrelevant. DaCosta associates this group with some liberation and feminist theologians. Since Type 4 involves many of the same themes embraced by pro-discontinuity theologians, I won't explore it very much further in this series. Theologian Richard John Neuhaus observes, "The irony is in the agreement between Lefebvre and the Liberal Party of discontinuity. Additionally, the consequences of either side being correct are similar. If even one conciliar principle is demonstrably discontinuous, it could throw into question several other conciliar statements, as well as the Church's claim to infallibility altogether." Backtracking to DaCosta's third category, pro-continuity theologians like Ratzinger defended the Council's continuity of principles, while acknowledging that its expression and applications of Christ's eternal laws did indeed change. In his Christmas Curia address, Benedict claims, It is precisely this combination of continuity and discontinuity at different levels that the very nature of true reform consists. Precisely how there can be discontinuity at different levels will be explored later in this series. Later in his address, Benedict mentions a few theological issues that sparked these debates regarding continuity, such as the Church's initial rejection but later acceptance of things like historical critical methods of biblical scholarship, the separation of church and state, and religious tolerance. But another prime example of the alleged discontinuity is the Church's seemingly changed stance on the doctrine of extra ecclesiam nulla salus, or no salvation outside the Church. Next episode will give an overview of this contested doctrine's history and introduce two of its most seemingly discontinuous expressions. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.